Some rooms remember more than they should. 20 years ago, my cousin vanished without a trace inside my grandfather's house. No signs, no noise, just gone. Now, after all these years of silence, that same room has started calling to me. And what I found when I went back, it changed everything I thought I knew about my family and about myself. I was 7 when my cousin Ben disappeared, and the last time I saw him, he was standing at the edge of the hallway in my grandfather's old farmhouse, half lit by the dusty orange hue bleeding through the curtains, his hand barely raised in a silent goodbye, or maybe a warning. I still don't know, and it haunts me. That house, with its cracking beams and the musty scent of forgotten summers, had always felt like a place preserved in some stale, unmoving time, where nothing new ever entered and nothing old ever truly left. My family never talked about Ben after that day. There were posters, brief mentions on local news, and a police report that went nowhere. But inside our home, his name became a ghost itself, unspoken, unwelcome, and unbearably heavy. I remember my mother removing every photograph of him from the albums, slipping them out with trembling hands, as if the paper itself might scream. My father said only once, in a voice colder than I'd ever heard it, he got lost where he shouldn't have been, and that was that. We stopped going to the house after that summer. The driveway grew over with weeds. The windows turned into eyes glazed with grime, and the silence that hung around it became a warning no one had to put into words. But for me, Ben wasn't just a cousin. He was my best friend. We were inseparable in that golden stretch of childhood where the world felt too big to be dangerous and too new to carry the weight of fear. We had our own hideout in the attic, our secret passwords, our rituals made of flashlight flickers and treasure maps drawn on napkins. He used to call me Scout because I always wanted to explore, and I called him Captain because he always knew where to go, what to do. That house, as strange and suffocating as it felt at times, was our kingdom. But that last day, something changed. Something unspoken passed between us, like the static in the air before a storm. We were in the garden, trying to catch frogs in the overgrown pond, when he suddenly dropped his net and said, "Don't go into the east room if I don't come back." I laughed, thinking it was part of the game, but his face, so serious, so much older than it had any right to be, told me he wasn't pretending. I didn't understand. I didn't ask questions. I didn't follow him. Minutes later, he was gone. They searched the entire property, the woods, even drained part of the pond, but there was no trace, no struggle, no clues. It was like he evaporated, and then the silence began, the kind that doesn't just fill a room, but grows roots into people's hearts. My aunt and uncle moved away a few months later. My parents forbade me from ever speaking his name, and the house, the one my grandfather left abandoned in his will, became a ruin in more ways than one. For years, I tried to forget. I told myself maybe he really did run away. Maybe he found a better life somewhere far from the heaviness of our family. But the truth is, I never believed that. Something in his eyes that day told me he wasn't leaving. He was being taken. Not by something supernatural or monstrous, but by something old, heavy, and painfully human. Now, almost 20 years later, I find myself standing at the edge of that same driveway, my car engine ticking as it cools, my breath catching my throat like I've walked into a place where the air remembers everything. The house stands just as we left it. Window panes cracked, porch steps bowed inward like a tired spine, ivy choking the brick like it's trying to strangle the past. I'm not here out of curiosity. I didn't come because of a dream or a sign. I came because last week, a letter arrived at my apartment. No return address. Just my name, written in handwriting I hadn't seen since I was 7. Inside was a single piece of lined notebook paper, yellowed at the edges, and a message written in blocky, careful letters. I'm still here. The room is open. Come alone. I knew that handwriting. Every shaky line of it. It was Ben's. I held that letter for hours, staring at it, smelling it, running my fingers over the ink as if I could feel the years inside it. At first, I thought it was a cruel joke, some elaborate prank. But who would do that? No one even remembers Ben anymore. No one but me. And something in that message didn't feel like a trick. It felt like a calling, like a whisper I'd spent years trying not to hear. So I packed a bag, took a week off work with some made-up excuse, and drove 5 hours to this forgotten town where my family name still causes whispers in the gas stations and stares in the diners. As I push open the gate, it creaks, of course, like something from a cliché horror film. I feel a strange mix of dread and duty. This isn't about finding answers. This is about finishing something that never should have been left undone. The front door is stiff, the wood swollen from time and rain, but it gives with a groan like it's been waiting for me. The air inside is thick with dust and silence. No signs of life, just the echoes of what was. I take slow steps down the hallway where I last saw Ben, half expecting to see him still standing there, hand raised, frozen in that moment that's burned into me. But there's nothing, just light filtering through broken blinds, illuminating dust like falling snow. I walk past the living room, past the kitchen where my grandmother used to make rhubarb pies, past the staircase that now seems taller, more imposing. My heart pounds as I reach the east end of the house, the part that was always colder, even in summer. The door to the room stands slightly ajar, just like in the letter. And for a moment, I feel like I'm 7 again, trembling with some instinct I don't fully understand, knowing that what's behind that door will change everything. I should turn around. I should leave. But I don't, because this time, I'm not letting him disappear alone. There's some silences that don't just fill a room. They grow inside people, settle into their bones, and reshape the way they move, speak, and even breathe. And that's what happened to my family after Ben disappeared. A silence so heavy it warped time, so oppressive it turned memories into minefields, and turned every family gathering into a delicate balancing act between pretending and forgetting. After that summer, it was as if Ben had never existed. His room at my uncle's house was packed up within a week. My aunt took down every photo and boxed up every toy, every drawing, every piece of clothing he had ever touched. She didn't donate them. She didn't throw them away. She just sealed them into cardboard tombs and stacked them in the attic like coffins, a quiet mausoleum for a child the world refused to mourn properly. I remember asking my mother where Ben had gone just once, and the way she looked at me, her eyes wide with something that could have been fear or rage or heartbreak. Maybe all three. She grabbed my wrist too tightly and whispered, "Don't ever bring him up again. Do you understand?" I nodded. Of course I did. But something in me fractured that day, not just because I miss Ben, but because I realized for the first time that adults could be afraid of something they couldn't even name. My father coped by retreating into work. Long hours, overnight shifts, sudden business trips that I suspected weren't necessary. He stopped coming home for dinner, started keeping a bottle in his desk drawer, and when I tried to talk to him about anything real, he would grunt and nod and pat my shoulder like I was a stranger passing him on the street. My mother became more brittle, always tired, always distracted, always halfway between tears and fury, like she was holding some invisible thing inside her chest that would shatter if she ever let it go. They didn't fight much, not openly, but the silence between them was louder than screaming. We stopped visiting family. Christmases were quieter. Birthdays passed without fanfare. And through it all, the house, sat untouched, a shadow on the edge of our memories, something we circle around like a wound that never healed, only festered. I grew up under that silence. It shaped who I became in ways I didn't fully understand until much later. I stopped asking questions. I learned to read between words, to study expressions of the things people weren't saying. I became cautious, inward. I wrote stories in secret notebooks, stories where kids disappeared but were found, where mysteries were solved, where pain had a reason and silence could be broken. But in real life, the silence stayed. School counselors called me withdrawn, imaginative, quiet. No one asked why. No one ever does. The only person who ever truly saw me during those years was my grandmother, my dad's mother, who never spoke directly about Ben but would hum lullabies when she brushed my hair and sometimes left old Polaroids on my bed without explanation. Photos of me and Ben playing in the garden or sitting side by side in the attic for what we built out of blankets and broomsticks. She never said a word about them, just smiled with eyes that looked a little more tired every year. I still have those photos. They're worn now, corners curled, images faded. But I keep them in a locked drawer, the way you might keep evidence of a dream you're afraid to forget. Sometimes I think she wanted me to remember, to carry something forward when the rest of the family seemed so desperate to erase him. I think she knew I would be the one to come back. The last time I saw her, she was in hospice, frail and thin and barely responsive. I held her hand and thanked her for the pictures, and her eyes met mine, sharp for just a moment, and she whispered, "Wasn't the house that took him. That was all." Then she closed her eyes, and within the week, she was gone. I never told anyone what she said. I don't know why. Maybe I was still afraid of the silence, still convinced that speaking aloud would summon something I wasn't ready to face. But that sentence lodged itself deep inside me, a splinter I couldn't dig out. It wasn't the house that took him. What did she mean? Who or what did take him then? And why? After her funeral, I found myself looking through her things, trying to make sense of fragments she left behind. A shoebox of photographs, an old locket with a picture of Ben tucked inside, and a note written in shaky cursive that simply read, "The room knows. Trust your memory." That note stayed with me for years. I kept it tucked in a novel on my bookshelf, pulled it out sometimes late at night when I couldn't sleep, stared at the words, and wondered what she saw, what she remembered, what she knew that no one else was willing to say. And now, standing in the ruins of my childhood, the hallway where I last saw him, the living room where we used to lie on our stomachs and draw spaceships with crayons, I can feel that silence pressing in again. It's thicker here, older. It lives in the floorboards, in the peeling wallpaper, in the smell of mildew and time. Every creak of the house feels like a breath held too long. Every shadow seems to stretch just a little too far. This isn't just an old building. It's a vault of everything unspoken, a container for grief so tightly sealed it hums with the pressure of it. And now I'm the only one left willing to open it. I didn't come back here to chase ghosts. I came because the silence never let me go. It followed me through childhood, into college, into the sterile apartment I call home, and the job I perform like a puppet on autopilot. It echoed in every unanswered question, every dream that ended with Ben's face just out of reach. And now, finally, it's brought me here, not to make peace, but to break the silence wide open. Because if Ben's still here, if even part of him is, then that silence isn't just tragic. It's cruel. And I'm done living inside it. I didn't plan to go through the desk drawers in the East Room, at least not that day. Not when I had barely set foot back inside the house and already felt like the walls themselves were tightening around me like a fist. But something about the air in that room, stale, yet oddly charged like the seconds before a lightning strike, made me linger longer than I meant to, and when I opened the lowest drawer, the one with the warped handle that had always stuck, I wasn't expecting to find anything except maybe a few dead insects or some old pens. But instead, sitting there beneath a faded road map and a crumpled takeout menu from a restaurant that no longer existed, was an envelope with my name on it. My name, in Ben's handwriting. I froze, knees buckling just slightly, heart stuttering in my chest in a way that made the room tilt. And for a second, I thought maybe I was hallucinating. Maybe exhaustion and the weight of memory had finally collided in my mind and created something that wasn't real. But the envelope was real, its paper brittle with age, yellowed at the corners, and sealed in a way that said it had never been opened. My hands trembled as I picked it up, stared at the blocky, uneven letters I remembered so vividly. Ben always wrote like he was carving the words into the page, and then I turned it over and saw the date, August 28, 2006. 10 days after he vanished. My stomach dropped. I was shaking so hard I could barely peel it open. Inside was a single sheet of lined paper, folded neatly in thirds, and as I opened it, the scent of something faintly familiar, grass, maybe, or old leather, rose from it like a whisper. The letter was written in pencil, the strokes light but deliberate. And as I began to read, my throat tightened with a mixture of fear and something dangerously close to hope. Scout. It began using the nickname only Ben ever called me. If you're reading this, then I messed up. I didn't mean to leave the way I did. I thought I'd have more time, thought I could come back before anyone noticed. But now I can't. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Please don't tell anyone you found this. They wouldn't understand. They didn't see what I saw. They didn't hear what I heard. I didn't want to scare you that day in the garden. I knew you'd follow me if I let you. You always followed me. That's why I had to lie. I said it was a game, so you wouldn't try to stop me. But this isn't a game. It never was. I don't even know how to explain it. Not really. But something's wrong with this place. Not haunted, not cursed. Worse than that. It's alive, kind of. Or maybe it's just listening, watching. I heard things in that room. Not voices, not ghosts. Just truths that felt like knives. I saw things that don't make sense but still felt real. And when I realized what I was seeing, what it meant for our family, I couldn't just sit with it. I had to go. I had to try to fix it. But now I think I might have made it worse. If I'm still alive when you find this, and I hope I am, you'll know where to look. It starts in the walls. The things hidden there, the stories no one tells. Don't trust what they told you. Don't trust what you remember. You were too young. You didn't see the whole picture. But you were always smart, Scout. Smarter than me. If you follow the truth far enough, you'll find me. Or what's left of me. I hope it's enough. I miss you. That was it. No signature. Just that single, devastating letter that cracked open everything I thought I knew about Ben's disappearance. The letter shouldn't exist. The timeline didn't make sense. If it was real and it felt real, then Ben didn't vanish that day. He left of his own will, and he tried to come back, or at least planned to, but something stopped him. Something tied to the house, to the family, to truths I hadn't even begun to understand. For hours I sat in that room, the letter in my lap, reading it again and again until words felt like scars carved into my brain. What did he mean by truths that felt like knives? What had he seen? What could be so horrible it drove a 12-year-old to run away from everything he knew without telling anyone but me, in a letter hidden in the very room he warned me to avoid? I thought about taking the letter to the police. But what would I say? What could they do now, 2 decades later? And if what Ben said was true, if the danger wasn't in being found but in being understood, then dragging it into the open might only bury it deeper. So instead, I did what I'd always done. I kept it to myself, locked the secret away in the only place I could control, my own mind. But even that wasn't safe anymore, because now I had something more dangerous than grief. I had questions, and worse, I had hope that Ben was still alive, that he had left a trail, that everything I had been told was a lie, or at least not the whole truth. That night, I slept on the living room couch, the letter under my pillow like a talisman. The house creaked and groaned around me, familiar in its discomfort, but I didn't feel afraid. Not yet. I felt like a wire had been tripped, like the past had suddenly begun unraveling itself, thread by thread. And somewhere inside that unraveling was Ben. Somewhere he was waiting. I just had to follow the thread. I just had to keep pulling, no matter what came loose. The East room was smaller than I remembered, or maybe time had just distorted the way grief and silence distort everything else, turning memories into impressions, and impressions into something more dangerous. Something you start to trust even when your senses are screaming that they've been compromised. But it was unmistakably the same room Ben had warned me about, the one he said not to enter if he didn't come back. And now I was standing inside it, heart thudding in my throat, eyes slowly adjusting to the dim, gold-tinted light that filtered through the yellow curtains and hit the walls like something rotten and warm, like breath that had been held for too long and finally released. The wallpaper was the first thing I noticed. How could I not? It wasn't just yellow. It was violently yellow, a jaundiced, sickly tone that looked like it had been dyed with spoiled butter and old teeth, and it peeled in thick, curled strips from every corner, revealing patches of crumbling plaster beneath that looked bruised and water-stained. The pattern was erratic, floral maybe, or meant to be, but it had decayed into something more abstract over the years, and as I stared, I realized with sudden, chilling clarity that the longer you looked at it, the more it seemed to move. Not literally, not like some haunted movie trick, but in the way that shadows seem to dance on the edge of firelight when you're too tired to know what's real. The pattern didn't just repeat. It writhed. It spiraled in on itself in ways that made your eyes ache. And worse, it felt like it was watching me back. I took a cautious step into the room, the floorboards groaning beneath my weight like they were warning me, and immediately I was hit with the scent I hadn't noticed in the hallway. Mold, yes, and dust, But something else, too. Something like wet copper and old paper, the smell of things forgotten on purpose. There was a bed frame pushed against the far wall, mattressless and rusted. Its slats bent as if someone had tried to twist them apart with their bare hands. A small, broken dresser sat to the left, its drawers gutted, and beside it in the corner, a child's chair, too small for an adult, too big for a doll, painted white once but now chipped down to the bone. On the wall opposite the bed was a closet door, slightly ajar, and though I didn't want to look inside, I knew I would. That's the thing about trauma, about memory. You're always chasing the thing that broke you, even if you don't realize it until it's too late to turn back. But first, the wallpaper. I couldn't stop looking at it. I moved closer, drawn in despite myself, and as I reached out to touch one of the curling strips, I noticed something scratched into the wall just beneath the paper's edge, letters, faint and jagged, like they'd been carved with a nail or a piece of broken glass. I peeled back the paper gently, and there was 3 words etched over and over in a shaky, frantic scrawl. The walls remember. Again and again, in overlapping lines, the letters colliding into one another until they blurred into a single desperate message. My skin prickled. I backed away, breath shallow, the edges of my vision narrowing like a tunnel. What did that mean? Who wrote it? Ben? Someone else? I looked back at the door, considered leaving, just for a minute, just to breathe. But then my eyes caught something else. Beneath the edge of the bed frame, barely visible, was a corner of what looked like more paper. I knelt slowly, reached under, and pulled out a small, dust-covered notebook with faded green cover. The pages were brittle, the writing inside smudged in places, but it was unmistakably Ben's handwriting again, childish, uncertain, but his. The first page simply read, "If I get lost, follow this." What followed wasn't a diary, not exactly. It was more like notes, observations, sketches, fragments of thoughts, none of them in order, none of them dated. He wrote about the wallpaper, about the feeling of being watched, about dreams where the room whispered to him in a voice that sounded like our grandfather's, but said things no one should ever say. He wrote about scratching the words into the wall with a bent safety pin, about how the room keeps things, about how sometimes he would hear footsteps behind the walls and thought maybe they weren't footsteps at all, but memories trying to escape. One page caught my eye more than the rest, a crude map of the house, drawn in pencil, but with one addition that didn't make sense. Behind the closet, Ben had drawn another room, small, square, with a question mark in the center. I flipped through the rest of the notebook, but there was no explanation, just that map and the increasingly panicked scrawl of someone who was either unraveling or desperately trying not to. I stood, the floor creaking beneath me again, and turned toward the closet. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my teeth. The door resisted at first, then gave with a sigh that sounded almost disappointed. Inside, dust danced in the weak shaft of light, revealing only an old coat rack and stack of flattened cardboard boxes. Nothing unusual, nothing sinister. But the back wall looked off. The paint didn't match. The boards were newer, and when I knocked gently, it sounded hollow. I dropped to my knees, ran my fingers along the seam where the wall met the floor, and there it was, a gap, barely wide enough to fit 2 fingers, just enough to suggest a false panel. I hesitated. Every part of my body screamed to stop, to leave, to pretend I hadn't seen it. But I couldn't. I pressed harder, and with a soft pop, the panel gave way, swinging inward on a hidden hinge to reveal a narrow, pitch-black crawl space. The air that rushed out was cold, not in temperature but in sensation, like stepping into a memory you didn't want. I couldn't see more than a foot ahead, but I could feel the weight of something waiting inside. History maybe, or truth, or worse. I didn't go in. Not yet. I stood there, breathing the stale air, staring into the dark, clutching Ben's notebook like a lifeline. The wallpaper behind me seemed to breathe. The word the walls remember echoed in my mind like a chant, and somewhere deep inside me, something cracked open, a memory maybe, or a realization I wasn't ready to face. Because if Ben had found that crawl space, if he had hidden that letter in this notebook and still never come back, then whatever was behind that wall wasn't just part of the house. It was part of us. And I was about to find out why. The crawl space behind the closet wasn't long, 10 feet, maybe 12, But every inch it felt like crawling through time itself, through the soft, damp wood of buried memory and the suffocating stillness of secrets no one was supposed to find. And as I inched forward with only the dim glow of my phone lighting the narrow space, I could feel the weight of everything pressing around me. The house, the silence, Ben's letter, the smell of mold and dust rising, like breath on the floor, and the terrifying sense that I was moving not toward answers, but toward something much older and more personal in truth, something that had always been waiting for me. At the end of the passage was a small hatch, sealed with a metal latch that creaked as I twisted it open. And beyond that, a chamber no larger than a walk-in closet, unfinished and walled with old pine boards warped by moisture and time. The room was empty except for a single wooden crate, cracked at the corner, and as I pried it open, my fingers numb with cold, I found a pile of notebooks, dozens of them, each labeled with Ben's name and a date that stretched from the summer he disappeared until nearly 2 years later. My throat closed. He hadn't just vanished, he'd been here, or somewhere close. Long enough to write, long enough to watch. I pulled the top notebook free, opened to a random page, and began to read. Scout saw it, he wrote, but she doesn't know what she saw. I think she's blocking it out. I hope she does. I hope she forgets all of it. She was too little. She doesn't need to carry this. The words blurred as my eyes stung. My hands shook as I flipped to another page. I heard Dad and Uncle Jim again last night. They don't know I'm listening. They think I sleep through everything. But I hear them. The basement, the papers, the deal they made. I don't understand all of it, but it's bad. It's so bad. I think Scout was there that night. I think she saw what I saw, but it broke something in her. That's why she doesn't remember. I hope she doesn't remember. I can't let them know I know. I can't let them near her. They'd lie to her. They'd ruin her like they're ruined. She's the only good thing. I stopped breathing. My fingers gripped the pages like I could somehow hold the years between us if I just squeezed hard enough. Another entry, this one Messier angrier. I want to run away. I want to tell someone. But who would believe me? It's all buried. They made sure of that. And now I think Grandpa knew too. I think he started it. I found one of his journals. I read the things he wrote about Mom when she was little, about the rules. I think this house is where it all started. I think they brought us here on purpose. Scout was supposed to forget, but I couldn't. I won't. I felt sick, cold, empty. A truth was starting to take shape, jagged and unfinished, but unmistakable in its horror. My grandfather, my father, my uncle. Something happened in this house. Something that had been happening for generations, passed down like a ritual wrapped in silence. And Ben had found it. Worse, I had been there. I just didn't remember. I turned another page. This one was shorter. She woke up crying last night. Said she saw someone at the end of the hall. I think it was Grandpa. I think he was watching her sleep. She didn't know why she was scared. Just was. I took her to the attic and let her sleep in the fort. She calmed down. I didn't tell her what I saw. She didn't need to know. She never needs to know. My vision blurred. I pressed my forehead to floor. The notebook clutched to my chest like a dying thing. Ben hadn't just left because he was scared. He left because of me, to protect me, because he saw something he knew I couldn't handle. And he buried it all, his voice, his presence, his life, to keep me safe. My family didn't just silence his memory. They silenced the truth he was running from, or maybe toward. Either way, it was all here, in these notebooks, in this hidden room behind the lies and the wallpaper and the silence. I didn't want to believe it, didn't want to connect the dots, but I had no choice, because I remembered waking up that night. I remembered the fear, the cold, the shape at the end of the hallway. I remembered Ben's arms around me, his whisper, "You're okay? I'm here." I thought it was a nightmare. I thought it was nothing, but it wasn't nothing. It was a beginning. I read one more line before I closed the book. If she finds this, it means she's ready. I hope she forgives me. I collapsed in that hidden room and cried until I couldn't breathe, because I had never hated anyone in my family. Not really. Not even when they went silent. But now, I wasn't sure if I could love them again. Because silence isn't just a lack of noise. It's complicity. And mine had lasted far too long. Before any of the silence, before the house became a wound that breathed and pulsed and waited for one of us to come back, there were days when Ben and I were just two kids chasing dragonflies in the backyard, racing barefoot across the long stretch of overgrown grass behind our grandfather's house, while the sun pressed down like honey and the world still made sense. And I don't think I've ever felt more alive than in those summers, when time moved like warm. Water, and the only danger we knew was getting caught sneaking cookies in the kitchen or climbing too high in the gnarled old sycamore tree near the back fence. The one we claimed as our pirate ship, our spaceship, our castle. Depending on the mood of the day, Ben had a laugh that started in his chest and took a second too long to get out, like he had to decide whether to let it go or keep it for himself. And when he laughed, really laughed, it always made me laugh too, even if I didn't know why. We had our own language, gestures, looks, the kind of shorthand only children can invent. Whole conversations made of nonsense words and inside jokes. And he called me Scout because I always ran ahead, always wanted to be the first to see what was around the next bend. And I called him Captain because no matter what we were playing, he was always the one who came up with the rules. He was 2 years older than me, but it felt like more. He knew things, had thoughts that stretched beyond the boundaries of our tiny world. And even when I didn't understand them, I trusted him completely. He was my map, my compass, my best friend. I remember one afternoon, we couldn't have been older than 8 and 10, when we found a dead bird behind the shed, stiff and curled with its wings frozen mid-flight, like it had just fallen out of sky and never moved again. I was scared to touch it, afraid it would turn to dust, but Ben knelt down beside it, silent for a long time, and then said, "We should bury it. It deserves that." We spent the next hour digging a hole with plastic shovels, and he wrapped the bird in one of his old T-shirts before laying it in the dirt. We didn't talk much during the burial, just stood there with our heads bowed like we were performing some sacred rite, and afterward, he looked at me and said, "Don't forget where we put it." I didn't. Even now, I can still find that spot in my memory, the patch of earth behind a hydrangea bush where we built a tiny headstone out of smooth river stones. That's the kind of boy Ben was. Kind, strange in the best way, always seeing meaning where no one else bothered to look. We spent whole days exploring the attic of the old house, pretending we were archaeologists unearthing treasure from ancient civilizations, really just sifting through old newspapers, broken furniture, and yellowed photographs of people we didn't recognize but made up names for anyway. There was a trunk filled with my grandmother's clothes, lace gloves, moth-eaten hats, long skirts that smelled like perfume and dust, and we would play dress-up, strutting across the creaky floorboards with fake British accents, narrating our imaginary adventures like we were on stage. And then there was the fort, our sanctuary. We built it in the far corner of the attic with blankets draped over chairs and flashlights clipped to the beams, a secret space where the rules of the outside world didn't apply. We brought snacks up there, wrote our own comic books, made lists of things we'd do when we were older, become detectives, open a candy store, travel the world. Sometimes we just sat in the dark, side by side, whispering about our fears. Mine were silly back then. Spiders, thunderstorms, losing my favorite doll. But Ben's were quieter, deeper. He worried about growing up, about people changing, about forgetting things that mattered. Once he said, "Promise me we'll always remember this, even when we're old." And I did. I promise. I meant it, but time plays tricks. It doesn't just move forward. It pulls, it distorts, it buries. And somewhere along the way, between the last summer we spent at the house and the day Ben vanished, that innocence, the purity of our friendship, was tainted by something I didn't see coming. Or maybe I did. Maybe part of me knew, even then, that something in the house was wrong. That the adults around us moved differently when they didn't think we were watching. That their whispers behind closed doors weren't just grown-up things we weren't supposed to understand, but codes hiding something rotten. There were signs, I know that now, like the way my father's voice dropped when he talked to Grandpa late at night, or the way Ben would sometimes get quiet and far away, like he was listening to something only he could hear. One night, we were lying in the fort, and he said, "Do you ever think people aren't who they say they are?" I asked what he meant, and he didn't answer. He just stared at the ceiling like he was trying to see through it. I didn't push. I never pushed. And maybe that was my biggest mistake. I let him carry too much. Because while I was playing pretend, Ben was watching, learning, protecting. And when it all got too heavy, he did the only thing he could. He left. Not out of fear, not out of weakness, but out of love. That realization guts me, because we were just kids. We should have been worrying about scraped knees and bedtime stories, not family secrets and buried truths. And yet, Ben bore it all, alone, for me. I think about all the birthdays he missed, all the Christmases where there was one gift left unopened. Not because anyone forgot, but because no one dared to fill the void. I think about the person I became without him, quieter, more guarded, always waiting for something I couldn't name. And I wonder who he became in those years he spent hidden, writing notebooks in the dark, carrying memories I couldn't afford to remember. We were just kids, but we were more than that. We were everything to each other. And now, with the truth unraveling and the past rising like a tide I can't stop, I have to face the hardest part of all, that while I mourn his loss, while I learn to live in the absence he left behind, he was out there somewhere, mourning the part of me that never even got the chance to understand why he left. I owed him more. I still do. The IT started with a smell, the faintest trace with smoke and damp earth, something that should have faded long ago but returned with such precision that it unlocked something visceral in me, something I didn't know was still buried. And suddenly I wasn't in the East Room anymore, or even in the present. I was 7 again, barefoot on the cold hallway floor in a nightgown 2 sizes too big, walking toward the sound of voices in the dark, because I had woken up thirsty and too young to understand what fear could mean when it came dressed like people you trusted. And I didn't remember this until I was already halfway down the same hallway in the house, my hand brushing against the familiar bumps in the wallpaper, my body moving like it remembered even when my mind didn't want to. And when I stopped just outside the study, my grandfather's study, the one that always smelled like cigars and varnish, I realized that I had heard them that night, not in a dream, not imagined, but real. Voices low and sharp like knives pressed against each other. My father's voice and my grandfather's, with someone else there too, my uncle maybe, or someone who shouldn't have been. And there was a name they kept saying over and over, not Ben's name, but my mother's and then mine. And I remember holding my breath because I knew somehow, even then, that I wasn't supposed to hear those words, that they weren't safe. And as I stood there now in the exact same spot, decades later, my hand reached for the door like it had always meant to open it. And the moment it did, the memory crashed back like a wave breaking inside my chest. Ben standing in the far corner of the room, half hidden behind a coat rack, his face pale, his eyes wide with kind of panic I didn't understand. And me, smaller, sleepy, confused, whispering his name just loud enough for him to hear. And he turned to me so fast it scared me, not because of his face, but because he looked like someone who had seen something that didn't fit into the world we knew, something that didn't belong inside the shape of family or the safety of bedtime routines. And in the next moment, he was grabbing my hand, pulling me back down the hall, whispering urgently that I had to go back to sleep, that I hadn't seen anything, that I had to forget. And I remember now the way he led me to the attic stairs, our secret place, and sat with me in the dark, whispering made-up stories to cover the tremble in his voice. And I asked him what was wrong, and he just kept saying, "It's not safe anymore, Scout." And when I asked why, he looked at me like he might cry and said, "Because they made a choice a long time ago, and it wasn't supposed to reach us." And I didn't understand then, couldn't have, but I nodded anyway because his voice was shaking, and I hated seeing him afraid. And now I know that moment was the last time I ever saw him, because the next morning he was gone. And I told everyone I hadn't seen anything because I thought I was helping, because I thought that's what he wanted. And over the years, that memory twisted, sank, got buried beneath all the silence and shame and time until it became a dream. And then nothing. And now it was back, sharp and undeniable, and I felt like screaming, because the truth was unbearable. I was the last one to see him, the last one he trusted, and I let him go, not knowing what it meant, not realizing that he was already running, already choosing to disappear from me. And I carried that without knowing, and it shaped me, left holes I never saw until now. And suddenly all those years of waking up with panic I couldn't explain, of seeing shadows in corners that made me freeze, of feeling like something had been left undone, they made sense because something had been left undone. And it was me, my part in the story, my moment of truth buried so deep even I had forgotten it. And the guilt of it crashed into me like a second loss, not of Ben this time, but myself, because I had stood at the crossroads of his fate and mine, and said nothing, done nothing, because I was too young and he was too brave, and no one should have to carry that alone, especially not a child. And yet he did, and I let him, and now all I can think about is how cold. His hand felt in mine that night, how tightly he held it, like he knew it was the last time he could. And I remember now, as I stood there in that hallway, that I never said goodbye, not really, and maybe that's why I came back, to give him that, to tell him I remember, that I'm sorry, that I understand now what he did and why he did it, and that I will never forget again that IT started the second night, after I tried to sleep on the living room couch again, the same one that sagged in the middle, like a mouth mid-scream, the cushion stained with decades of other people's lives, and though I'd turn off every light, pulled the blankets tight around me, and closed my eyes to the sound of the wind pressing gently against the warped window panes, I couldn't fall asleep because something was wrong with the air, heavier than before, thick like the pressure right before a storm, like the house had swallowed too much and was finally, slowly, beginning to exhale, and I lay there listening, breath shallow, heart racing not from fear but from recognition, because I knew this wasn't the house changing. It was me, or more precisely, it was the part of me that had always belonged to this house, the part that had never really left, the child self that still crouched somewhere deep inside, wide-eyed and waiting. And as the darkness shifted, as the wooden bones of the place creaked and whispered, I realized I was no longer sure where I ended and the house began. The sound came first, not loud, not threatening, but steady, rhythmic, like a heartbeat in the walls. Thump, 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 as if the structure itself was alive and remembering, calling back the past to the hollow cavities between studs and plaster, and I sat up, staring into the dark, waiting for the sound to stop, but it didn't. It got closer, more insistent, and then I realized it wasn't a heartbeat at all. It was footsteps, impossibly slow, impossibly light, coming from the hallway, and I told myself it was nothing, the house settling, the wood shifting, mice maybe, but I knew better. I didn't move. I barely breathed. I stared into the black rectangle of the hallway, paralyzed, and though nothing stepped into view, the sound kept coming past the kitchen, past the stairwell, until it reached the living room doorway, and then it stopped. The silence that followed was worse, not because it was empty, but because it was full, bloated with the pressure of something unseen, and I felt it again, this time not in sound, but in sensation, the weight of memory blooming around me, hot and cold at once, a rush of moments that weren't mine anymore, but still belonged to me. Ben's hand slipping from mine, the whisper of wallpaper peeling the dark, the ache of silence so deep it echoed. I blinked, and when I opened my eyes again, it was morning. I don't remember falling asleep. I don't remember dreaming. But I woke with the taste of old pennies in my mouth and the distinct impression that something had been very close to me while I slept. I told myself to leave. I stood, packed my bag, walked to the door, but I didn't turn the handle. Something stopped me, not a sound or presence, but the unbearable sense that if I left now, I would carry this weight forever, that I would never get answers, never find Ben, never understand why the house had grown inside me like a second skin. So I stayed another night, and that's when the walls began to breathe. It's the only way I can describe it. I'd walk to the hallway and feel the wallpaper expand slightly under my fingertips, not in a literal sense. No rising bulges or pulsing vein effects. But in that way, old lungs swell with dust, with secrets, with the effort of trying to speak after decades of silence. The yellow paper in the east room began curling more, splitting at the seams, and underneath I found more carvings, not just the walls, remember, but now other names, dates, half-formed sentences etched in frantic lines. He saw it too. I told her to run, beneath the boards, and the most recent one, newer than the others, still fresh with crumbled plaster at its edges. It's not over. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the attic, surrounded by the ghost shell of the Fort Ben and I once built, the blankets long gone, the chairs toppled, the space smaller than I remembered, but still echoing with something warm, something that made the cold reality below it all the more unbearable. I heard noises that night, not voices, not whispers, but the sound of drawers opening, a chair scraping slowly across the kitchen floor, the front door unlocking and locking again without anyone touching it. And I told myself it was the wind, the shifting house, my fraying mind. But the truth is, the house wasn't doing anything supernatural. It wasn't haunted by anything else. It was haunted by me, my memories, my guilt, my trauma, Every breath I took seemed to pull the walls closer, like they were exhaling only when I wasn't looking, pressing their history against me like they were trying to force me to see. And it worked. I started remembering things I didn't even know I'd forgotten. Ben's hand on my shoulder the night. He led me to the attic. The look on his face when he said, "Don't tell them you saw me." The way he hugged me before he left. Not like a cousin, but like someone saying goodbye to the only part of themselves they couldn't bear to lose. I remembered hiding in the bathroom the next morning, too afraid to tell anyone he was gone, because something deep in me knew that if I did, they'd look at me the way they looked at him, as a threat. I started to question everything. My family, my childhood, my memories. I went through old photos, flipped them over, and found notes I'd never seen before. Summer before the move, Ben's last visit. Why had no one corrected that? Why had it always been treated like just another summer vacation, when it had clearly been planned, orchestrated, a final chapter? I found medical records hidden in the kitchen drawer behind old takeout menus, one with my name on it, from a child psychologist I don't remember visiting. The note on the file said episodes of disassociation, trauma suspected but unconfirmed. I sat on the kitchen floor for what felt like hours, the tile cold against my legs, the letter still folded in my lap, my mouth dry. The truth was unraveling fast now, too fast to stop. The house wasn't supernatural, it was a pressure chamber. Every wall, every floorboard, every groaning hinge held a fragment of the pain no one spoke of. It wasn't haunted, it was full, overstuffed with the grief, fear, shame, and denial of generations. And now it had me, not as a prisoner, but as a vessel. I stopped eating. I stopped sleeping. I stopped answering my phone. Time ceased to move. I began living in both timelines at once. 7 and 30, lost and seeking, terrified and resolute. And the house accepted that. It let me in. It opened itself to me in ways I wasn't prepared for. The wallpaper in the east room peeled back on its own one night, revealing a second hidden panel I hadn't noticed before. This one cut into the floor beneath the dresser, sealed with rusted nails and covered in symbols I recognized from Ben's journals. Symbols he said he'd copied from our grandfather's books. Strange spirals and intersecting lines that didn't look evil but didn't feel right either. I haven't opened it yet. I'm afraid of what I'll find, but I know I will. I have to, because I'm too deep now. I've breathed in too much of the past. I've swallowed its dust, its secrets. The house and I were no longer separate. We've merged. And until I finish what Ben started, until I uncover what lies beneath those boards, neither of us will be free. I didn't call ahead, didn't text, didn't even knock when I reached my parents' house. I just walked in, the front door still sticking at the hinge the way it had when I was a child, and I half expected to be met with a familiar smell of coffee and lemon polish. But all I got was the stale air of a house too quiet for how many memories it was supposed to contain, and I found my father, in the den, seated in the same armchair he'd occupied for as long as I could remember, reading glasses perched low on his nose, a newspaper spread across his lap, as if the world outside still made sense. And when he looked up and saw me, his daughter, the one who hadn't spoken about Ben in 20 years, now standing in his living room with dust still clinging to her jeans and her eyes bloodshot from days of unraveling history. He froze, not in surprise, but in something colder like recognition, like the exact moment he realized the dam had broken and the flood was here. And I said nothing at first, just stared at her while the weight of everything I'd learned pressed against my ribs like a scream building from the inside out. And then I finally said, "I remember," and his face didn't twitch, didn't break. But his hand slowly folded the newspaper in half like he needed something to do, and I said it again, louder this time. "I remember that night. I remember hearing you. I remember seeing Ben in the hallway, and I found his notebooks. I found what he left behind, and I watched the color drain from his face, watched the way his body seemed to cave inward, and then I asked a question that had burned a hole through every thought I'd had since I left the house. What did you do?" And for a moment, just a moment, I thought he would deny it, thought he'd give me the practice half-truths he'd been feeding himself for decades, but instead he leaned back in his chair and looked at me with eyes so tired they didn't belong to the man who raised me, and in a voice too steady to be anything but prepared, he said, "It wasn't supposed to go that far." My knees buckled before I could stop them, and I sat down on the edge of the coffee table, staring at him like he was someone else, a stranger who'd been wearing my father's face all my life. And I said, "Go on." And he did, not because he wanted to, but because he knew he had no choice anymore, because the silence was breaking whether he liked it or not. He told me it started long before Ben and I were born. Before even he was born, something passed down from his father, my grandfather, a legacy of secrets disguised as traditions, of obedience disguised as loyalty, of silence disguised as protection. And he said that when he was a boy, there were rules in that house, rules you didn't question. Certain rooms you didn't go into, certain people you didn't talk about, and if you saw something you didn't understand, you never asked questions, because asking meant you'd seen too much, and seeing too much made you part of it. And then he told me about a night, years before Ben disappeared, when my grandfather had called him and my uncle into basement, had shown them papers, letters, photographs, things that didn't make sense, things that shouldn't have existed, and told them it was their responsibility now, their burden. And he didn't say what was in those papers at first, but I didn't need him to. I saw in his eyes the horror he had swallowed and buried and called duty for far too long. It was abuse, I said quietly, and he flinched like I'd struck him, and then he nodded once, and I asked, "Did you know what was happening to Ben?" And he said, "Not at first, not until it was too late." And the shame in his voice broke something in me, because this man who had taught me how to ride a bike, who had held my hand after I scraped my knees, had also known that his nephew had been hurt and said nothing, done nothing, because the cost of truth was too high. "Why didn't you protect him?" I asked, and he said, "Because if I did, I'd have to admit what I let happen to myself." And I stopped breathing for a second, the room spinning, and then he said, "He wasn't the first, just the one who ran." And that was the moment the last of my childhood crumbled, not because of what he'd done, but because of what he hadn't. Because of all the years he looked at me and pretended everything was fine, all the years he let me believe Ben had vanished without a reason, when the truth was sitting like a landmine inside our history, waiting for someone to step on it. "Ben saw something," I said, and he nodded. "He saw me," he replied. "He saw the way I flinched when Dad walked into the room. He saw the way I froze when he touched your shoulder. And he started asking questions. And one night, he found the journals, and then he knew." I stood then, my body shaking, and I wanted to scream, to break something, to undo everything I just heard. But all I could say was, "You let him run," and my father said it was the only thing I could do for him. I couldn't protect him. I couldn't protect you. But I could let him go. I could look the other way. And then he said the words that would echo in me forever. I told him how to get out. And I realized then that the silence in our family hadn't been accidental. It had been survival, a compact made between cowards and victims. And I was the product of that pact. And me? I asked, "What about me?" And his voice broke for the first time as he whispered, "You were too little. You didn't remember. I thought if I just kept you away from that house, you'd never find out. But I had found out, and now I could never not know. I left without another word. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see the man behind me anymore. All I wanted was to find the one who had left because he loved me enough to carry what I couldn't. And to tell him I finally understood I found him in a town so small it barely had a name, a place buried in the hills of northern Oregon where the roads narrowed into dirt paths and the trees leaned so close over the pavement it felt like driving through a tunnel of silence. And when I reached the address, an old trailer parked at the edge of a forgotten forest, surrounded by nothing but moss, broken tools, and quiet, I sat in the car for what felt like hours, staring at the front steps as if they might collapse under the weight of what I'd come to say. Because even though I had tracked him down with the meticulous desperation of someone who had nothing left to lose, I wasn't ready to see him. Not like this. Not after everything. Not after learning that he had disappeared not just to escape, but to save me. And I didn't know if I would find my cousin, or a stranger, or if maybe those two were now the same person. I didn't knock at first. I stood on the front step and listened to the wind, to the birds, to the creaking of the trailer walls. And then finally, I rapped twice with a hand that didn't feel like it belonged to me, and when the door opened, I didn't breathe, because it was him, older, thinner, with hair cropped short and eyes that looked like they'd forgotten how to sleep, but it was Ben, undeniably, irrefutably, my captain, and for a second neither of us said anything. His face was unreadable, caught between disbelief and fear and something softer, something like recognition, and then he whispered, "Scout," and I broke. I reached for him but stopped myself halfway because I didn't know if I had the right. And then he did something I wasn't expecting. He stepped forward and hugged me, tight, not like someone happy to see you, but like someone trying to confirm you were real. And I felt all the years between us collapse in that moment. All the nights I spent wondering if he was alive. All the dreams I had where he was just out of reach. All the guilt I carried like a second skin. We went inside. The trailer was sparse. Clean but worn, like someone lived there just enough to survive but never enough to settle. And he made tea without asking, the way he always had. And we sat at a small table covered in notebooks, maps, newspaper clippings, all signs that he hadn't stopped searching either, that maybe he'd been waiting for this too. I didn't know where to start, so I told him everything. The house, the letter, the journals, the hidden crawl space, the confrontation with my father, the memories that came back like waves with teeth, and he listened in silence, nodding slowly, his fingers wrapped around his mug, like it was the only thing keeping him anchored. When I finished, he said nothing for a long time, just stared at the wall behind me, his jaw tight, his eyes unreadable. And then he said, I thought if I stayed away, they'd leave you alone, that if I disappeared, they wouldn't have a reason to look at you too closely. I told him they didn't, that they pretended he never existed, that I was left in the wreckage of a story I was never allowed to understand. And he nodded again, like he had always feared that might be true. I wanted to come back, he said, so many times, but I didn't know if I'd make it worse. His voice cracked on the last word, and I reached across the table, took his hand. You didn't make it worse, I said. You saved me. He looked away, eyes shining. I was just a kid, he whispered. I didn't know what I was doing. I was scared. I didn't want you to remember, but I couldn't stay. Not after what I saw. Not after what I heard. He told me everything then. About the journals he found in our grandfather's basement. About the rituals, the control, the generational patterns passed off as discipline and protection. About the way he confronted our uncle and was told to forget it or leave. And he did leave, because forgetting wasn't an option. He'd seen too much. He'd seen me cry in the attic, not knowing why I was afraid but shaking anyway. And he made a decision no child should have to make. To vanish, to erase himself from our lives in order to give me a chance at something else. I kept track of you, he said quietly. I knew where you went to college. I saw your graduation photos. I even watched you read poetry at that bookstore once. I laughed, tears slipping down my cheeks. Why didn't you say something? He shook his head. Because I was afraid you wouldn't recognize me. Or worse, that you would. There was a pause, thick with things we couldn't say. I remember now. I said finally, that last night, the hallway, what you said to me. I didn't understand then, but I do now. He smiled, just barely. You were so small, he said. I didn't want to leave you, but staying was an option. It never should have been your burden, I said. You were a kid too. We were just kids, he echoed, his voice raw. But we were the only ones who saw it. We talked for hours. About the house. About the silence. About what comes next. And the truth is, I didn't get all the closure I wanted. He didn't hug me again. He didn't say he'd come back with me. He's not ready, not yet, maybe never. The trauma runs too deep. But he gave me something I never thought I'd have again, his presence, his voice, his forgiveness. And before I left, he handed me something, one final notebook, different from the rest. If you're going back there, he said, take this. It's the one I never finished. I held it like a sacred thing. What's in it? I asked. The end, he said, or maybe the beginning. I returned to the house not to uncover anything new, but to sit with it, to sit with what it had become, what it had always been, what it had taken from us, and what we had let become. Because I understood now that the house itself wasn't haunted, not in the way people mean when they whisper about ghosts or curses or flickering lights in the attic, but in the much more terrifying way that houses become haunted by us, by the people who fill them with secrets and silences and rituals no one dares to name. And as I stepped inside for what I knew would be the last time, I felt no fear, only gravity. The kind that settles in your spine when you finally stop running. The kind that makes you want to stand perfectly still so you don't disturb whatever fragile truth is holding itself together inside your chest. The wallpaper in the East Room was almost entirely peeled away now, sagging like shit skin, revealing the bones beneath, the raw wood, the splintered nails, the names scratched into the walls like echoes that had never quite faded, and I traced them with my fingertips, reading each one aloud. Not like an incantation, but like a eulogy, because these were not hauntings. These were memories, trapped and restless and finally released. In the quiet of that room, I began to understand that what lingered here was not some malevolent presence, but a residue of pain too long ignored, of love twisted by fear, of people who chose silence, because speaking would force them to become someone else. The house had become a container, a vault for every moment that should have been screamed but was swallowed instead. And every time Ben and I had played in the attic, every time we built a fort or buried a bird or whispered our dreams into the dark, we had been floating on top of a history we weren't meant to see, a history we were never meant to survive. But somehow we did. I sat on the floor in the East Room and opened the final notebook Ben had given me, the one he said he'd never finished. And as I turned the pages, I realized it was different from the others, not full of warnings or fear or frantic scribbles, but letters. To me, dozens of them, dated across the years, short and fragmented at first. I hope you're still laughing. I saw your picture. You looked strong. I dreamt about the fort last night, but then fuller, deeper, like he was building a bridge from whatever place he'd exiled himself to, reaching across time to keep us connected in whatever way he could. He wrote about the people who helped him survive, about the towns he passed through, about the quiet places where he sat alone, and thought about what he left behind. And every letter ended the same way. I'm sorry. I love you. Don't forget me. I cried reading them, not just for what we lost, but for what we managed to hold on to without even knowing it. Because love, real love, doesn't need permission to persist, it just does. And though I had spent years thinking I was alone in my grief, I now knew that I had never truly been alone at all. I stayed in that house until sunset, letting the golden light fill the rooms one last time, watching the dust swirl through like ghosts that were finally free to leave. And I walked every hallway, opened every door, not because I was searching for more clues, but because I wanted the house to see me now, whole, broken, scarred, but standing. And I wanted to see it, too, for what was not a place of answers, but a monument to the dangers of silence. I found myself back in the attic, the place where it had all begun, and I sat cross-legged in the corner where our fort used to be, and I whispered goodbye, not just to Ben, but to the child I had been, the one who didn't understand, the one who blamed herself, the one who carried the weight of forgetting for too long. I whispered goodbye to the lies, to the fear, to the shame that had kept me from asking the questions I always should have asked. And I felt, for the first time, the beginnings of something like peace, not closure, not forgiveness, but the first breath after surfacing from deep water, lungs burning, heart pounding, but alive. When I left the house, I didn't look back, not because I was afraid of what I'd see, but because I didn't need any more. The house had given me what I came for. Not justice, not vengeance, but understanding. It wasn't haunted. We were. And now, maybe we didn't have to be. I went back one last time. Not because I needed more answers, but because something inside me told me the story couldn't end until I said what had never been said, until I stood in that room not as a frightened child, not as someone clawed at the edges of memory, but as the person I had become, shaped by loss, lit by truth, scarred and steadied by everything Ben had carried for me, everything I had finally learned to carry for myself. And I brought only one thing with me, a letter, folded twice and sealed in a plain white envelope, addressed in my own handwriting to no one, or maybe to everyone who had ever been broken by silence, by the way of things left unspoken, by the long shadow of generational pain passed like heirlooms in dark rooms behind closed doors. The house was empty now, truly empty, the kind of quiet that doesn't beg to be filled, but stands still in it, proud and tired and finally done holding secrets that were never its own to keep. And as I stepped into the East Room, the room that had once been a warning, a wound, a vault, I felt a strange calm settle in my bones, not peace exactly, but something close to it, like the stillness after a long cry, when your breath evens out and your body remembers what it feels like to rest. And I sat, on the floor, cross-legged in the same spot, where Ben's handwriting still lived beneath the peeled wallpaper, and I placed a letter gently against the wall, tucking under the loose floorboard I'd found during my last visit, and I whispered something I didn't plan, something that rose from deep inside me like it had always been waiting. I remember you, and I forgive you. I didn't know if I was speaking to Ben, to my father, to myself, maybe all of them, maybe none. But the room felt different after that. Not lighter, not absolved, but quieter, like it had exhaled for the first time in years. I stood, ran my fingers one last time across the carved words on the wall. The walls remember, and I smiled just a little, because now I did too, and that remembering didn't break me. It made me whole in a way I hadn't thought possible. I walked through the house slowly, touching the banister, the kitchen table, the doorknobs, not to hold on to them but to say goodbye. And when I stepped outside into the late afternoon sun, I didn't look back. Not because I didn't care, but because I no longer had to prove anything to that place. It had taken enough, and I had given back what I could. I drove for hours without music, letting the silence be mine this time, not something inherited or forced, but chosen. When I finally pulled off the road and found a quiet overlook above the trees, I sat there for a long time, thinking about how stories end, how we're told they need resolution, clarity, closure. But the truth is, some stories just fade into us, become part of our skin, our blood, our voice, and they never really end. They just change shape. Ben is still out there. I don't know if he'll ever come back, if he'll ever walk to the front door of my apartment and say, "I'm ready now." But that's not what matters. What matters is that I found him once, and he found me, and we remembered each other across the silence. What matters is that we were both just kids, and we survived in the only ways we knew how. And maybe that's enough. As I sat watching the sky change color, I thought about the room, not the house, not the walls, but that one room where everything changed, where a boy chose to vanish to protect someone he loved, where a girl forgot to survive, and where the truth waited, patient and quiet, for decades until it was finally spoken aloud. It still calls my name sometimes, in dreams, in the echo of creaking floorboards, in the way certain shadows fall across my bedroom wall. But I no longer fear it. I no longer run from it. I simply listen. And then I answer, not with fear or apology, but with memory, with truth, with love. The room still calls my name. And now, I finally know what to say.